All right, so this is author James Rosone coming to you guys live. Our goal today is to provide some unique commentary and perspective on the war in Ukraine and where we think it may head in the next 72 to 96 hours. And just kind of discuss and talk about what we think is going on and maybe what we think will happen next. I'm a thriller writer by trade. I write a lot of espionage and military thrillers. I can look up my stuff on Amazon. I will list all the books that we've done on this. Our one main book I would mention is we wrote an incredible book called Battlefield Ukraine. Came out 5 years ago. And if you were to have read that book, you would almost wonder if Putin had read this book, because he seemed to use a lot of the justifications to invade Ukraine straight from our book. Kind of uncanny. Hopefully the rest of that series does not come to fruition, because it entails a unholy triad between the Russians and the Chinese deciding to dethrone the West and just world war. So let's hope that doesn't happen. It's fun to read. We just don't want to experience it. So with that, I will we'll start with Humphrey and then we'll work our way on down. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and what book you've written?
I'm, excuse me, James, I'm Humphrey Hawksley. I'm a former BBC Foreign Correspondent and a thriller writer and a non-fiction writer, and also something with that you know this, James, called Future Histories. So it's not a sort of character-driven, romance-driven thing. It's a plot-driven based on real-life stuff. So I've done 3 of those. The first one was 25 years ago, actually, called Dragon Strike, which was a US China war in the Pacific. I then did Dragon Fire, which was India, China, and the India, China, and Pakistan together there. And then I thought I'd do a third one to finish it off, called the Third World War, which had a Russia in there, very much like today, which you know, surprised me actually. I did a non-fiction book in between that, which didn't go down well on your side of the pond, because it was a post-Iraq book, post-Iraq invasion book, the height of the insurgency, that I covered a lot there. And you were there too, weren't you, James?
3.5 years in
Iraq. We had that exchange, didn't we? When I was doing Lena Sisko, who was in Guantanamo, and you were in Baghdad, weren't you, doing similar job? And that I call that book Democracy Kills, because then I was going around all of these places there where we had tried to export democracy, and it was a complete chaos. And I've now done I did a couple of other standalones, but I'm now on a thriller series that begins on the US-Alaska border, on the Little Diomede Island, which is the island that is actually 2 or 3 miles away from the Russian island of Big Diomede. So when Sarah Palin said Alaskans can see Russia from their backyards, she was telling the truth. And I went there and I spent some time on that island during the Crimea, or just after the Crimea crisis, actually, to check out how that border worked. And a thriller series came from that. I've just finished the fourth one. Yeah, the fourth one of that, which is out in August. And the reason that I was so glad you called this is I've got the copy editing of that thriller in at the moment, and I'm wondering how to tweak it, because this Ukraine is a 9/11. Yeah. I mean, it's not going to go away quickly, and therefore it has to be referenced, I think, in all the work we do.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's kind of through my own Monroe Doctrine series me and Alex have been writing is a little like, oh, crap, because we have a pretty prominent angle with the Russians actually working with NATO in the West and encountering China when China actually invades and attempts to seize half of Russia. Yeah. You know, so there's a unique angle there. It's funny you mentioned Alaska, because my grandfather actually had fought in Alaska in World War II. He was up in Attu Islands with the army when they were having to go and
was he on Commander Island, was he? The only island, only piece of American territory the Japanese ever took. Yeah, he did that, did he?
Yeah, he was up there, froze his butt off up there, but he's like, hey, I got stuck for 4 years up in Alaska, and I didn't have to go fight in the rest of Asia and the rest of the Pacific. So we'll switch over to Mark now. Mark, you and I've known you for almost 4 years. You're one of our current beta readers who's been helping us craft a lot of the books in the series, from our sci-fi to our military thrillers. So it's great to have you on. I'm excited to have you as a a beta reader and aspiring writer to bring some ideas and perspective from your neck of the woods in England.
Yeah, I'm not a military person by craft. I did try to get in when I was younger, but I'm in the IT field and work in e-commerce. But I'm very passionate about keeping up on current affairs. Even in the run up to wanting to go into the military, I was always interested in it. I've stayed on that, and I've been trying to get the hang of being a writer as something to aspire to outside of that. And as you said, I've been lucky enough to be able to be part of the books that you guys have been writing, and it's been interesting because I enjoyed the books anyway, which is how I got involved in it. But actually being able to see it earlier and look at and contribute to the viewpoints is also interesting, because obviously, as you said, I come from a very different background and different neck of the woods, so to speak. But it helps you to, as you said, to think about things from different directions, and that's an important thing for everyday life anyway. But also, if you're going to be a writer, it's definitely got to be pretty important. And how politicians think they can get away with just imposing their worldview on everybody else because they're right is the height of egotism.
It is. Yeah. So, and then we've got, we've got Jordan. Now you're from Northern Ireland, so you're going to be able to provide us with a completely different perspective of a different British angle in view on this whole operation, what's been going on. So why don't you just briefly tell us a little bit about you, and then we'll wrap it up with Alex next, and then we'll get into this.
Yes, sure. So I'm Phil Jordan. I'm in Belfast in Northern Ireland. So we've have sort of a unique spot within the United Kingdom anyway, and that we were, I suppose, my whole childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood, we were within the grip of our troubles, which was civil unrest and bombs and that sort of thing. So growing up, I think looking at the sort of things that were going on here at that particular time was the guerrilla war, the sort of what happens when there is an occupying force, if you want to call it that. We're, and Humphrey and Mark will probably know this from watching the news over here, we're just in a really incredibly complex little part of the UK. So from my perspective, I'm thinking of what happened here, but it wasn't total war that's happening at the moment in Ukraine. I was involved in security systems in terms of initially the protection of people and property in my youth and the start of my career. And then that, when 1998, the Good Friday Agreement came in, that sort of expanded into different things. Over lockdown then, I had always had an ambition to write, and I predominantly write a crime thriller series, which is based in Northern Ireland in Belfast, which deals with the current organised crime angles with the shadow of the past overhanging that. But also I write a military thriller series, a Task Force Trident series, which the first book in that, Agent in Place, dealt with the Russian aggression in Syria, and the protagonist in that book was put into a fictional city to extract an agent in place with evidence of Russian war crimes. So that series will continue to expand as well. However, I think just on everything that's going on, I've been thinking over the last few days, it will be quite hard to write whenever you see what is actually happening to people.
Yes, very much so.
So that's me, yeah. Child of conflict and recently appointed writer of crime and thrillers. So thanks.
Yeah, no, it's great to have your perspective on here, and I especially coming from Northern Ireland, because you've been in the thick of growing up with the urban conflict and the incidents that were going on there, and that was a real unique experience. And we're likely to see a lot of that kind of experience start to play out in Ukraine in the next, in the coming months, in the next, 3, 4, 5, 6 months down the road, and it could last several years potentially too. So it'll be interesting to hear your thoughts on that. And if we continue to do these kinds of conversations, 2, 3 years, 2, 3 months from now, it'll definitely be great to circle back with you and get your take on how the situation has evolved even further. So we'll briefly wrap up with Alex, and I'll start posing some questions and start teasing some information out of you guys.
Yeah, okay, so I'm Alex Aronson, and I was a Russian translator about 30 years ago for the Navy. And that sort of started my formal education with the Russians. And I guess I grew up in a Navy family, though, so I had a lot of history with that. We lived overseas in the Philippines for a while, and I was always very interested in international relations and how all that worked, especially during the Cold War. And so when I got out of the Navy, I went back to school and I got an undergraduate degree in international relations. And I was getting ready. I actually took a year off after undergraduate before I went to graduate school so I could focus on my applications. And I was trying to go into a direct PhD program at the University of Maryland. And this was a slam dunk for me because I had graduated at the top of my class as an undergrad, and the dean of my school had just left and gone to the University of Maryland. So this was all kind of coming together. And then a bunch of jackasses flew some airplanes into buildings, and I kind of panicked, and I thought I clearly don't know anything about international relations, the effect of non-government organizations on non-state players. And so I decided to hell with it, and I went and I got my Juris Doctor, my law degree instead. And I don't regret that. It's been a great decision. But it was that there was always something that was still kind of missing with that international relations flair. And so I actually started writing just before the pandemic, the fall before, so around August. I picked up my laptop and I said, okay, if I can do 30,000 word short story on Operation Eagle Claw, then maybe I can write something, maybe I can do something. And from there, I had started, I got a really bloated 140,000 word manuscript that over the last couple of weeks I've hacked down to back down to the 100,000 word range. But I was talking to James, asking him if he had any advice, and he said, "Oh, I got better than that. Why don't you come on in and we'll work together on some stuff." And so, yeah, we wrote the Monroe Doctrine Volume 4 and Volume 5 together, and James alluded to this earlier. It's a little weird. It feels a little weird right now because we wrote some very sympathetic Russian characters, or at least I felt they were very sympathetic, and it's a little weird to now have the entire world rooting against the Russians, which clearly they're the aggressors in this conflict. But it does kind of put you in an odd spot, and maybe we need to circle back on Volume 5 and make something happen. I don't know. But that's how I got here.
Yeah, I may have to write some sort of adjustment in book 6 to now have to compensate and deal with this. But and I've been frank for years that in reality, the true enemy or threat to democracy that we need to be watching, who is in the actual position of dethroning the West, is China. Their infiltration across every sector of the West is just so profound and so impactful. And what they're doing is it's through economics. So, the whole thing was, how did the Chinese defeat the Mongolians? They assimilated them. They didn't bother to fight them. They just assimilated them from the inside out. And we're seeing that manifestation take place with China through their Belt and Road Initiative and other things. And we could go on and talk about a lot of China aspects. It had always been my hope that there would have been an opportunity or a way for us to figure out some way to shift Russia's focus from Eastern Europe and get them on board with us as in some sort of relationship manner to help us handle and deal with China. And unfortunately, I think that is probably permanently shattered at this point and likely may never happen because of what has transpired in Ukraine. And it's truly sad for both the Ukrainians, it's sad for the Russians, and it's sad for us as the West in figuring out how are we going to handle China, because now it's not just going to be handling China, it's going to be handling China and Russia, who are now sadly forming an even closer alliance and bond together because of this conflict. So that's going to be a whole nother can of worms, and that's probably something we should discuss in a couple of Zoom calls, maybe in a few weeks or a few months when things have shaken out a little bit more and we start to see some more effects. So with that, I want to start posing some questions. So I'll call out questions to a couple of you guys individually, and then the rest of you guys just stay muted, and we'll give you a few minutes. I may interrupt you then to either pull out another piece of question or to let you know we need to wrap it up, and we're going to move on to the next person so we can try to get more people involved in this. So I think my first question is to Humphrey, is asking you, with what we've been seeing going on in Ukraine, and this is really good for you as a former foreign correspondent with the BBC. We've heard a lot of discussions over the last week about how the Russians are using, cluster munitions, thermobaric weapons against specific targets inside Ukraine or military objectives that they've determined. And we continue, the term has been used that these are illegal weapons, that these are war crimes. And my big question to this and in criticism of using those terms for that is, do you think that we are setting ourselves up for a serious problem by using that term with what's going on in Ukraine, when we look back and we can realize that thermobaric weapons were used for 19 years in the war against Afghanistan? And they were used in Iraq to great effect against caves. That's the premier weapon to use against caves. And cluster munitions, I'm sorry, when people are talking about, hey, let's send in some A-10s to go hit that Russian column, what is the number one weapon they're going to use on that column? Cluster munitions. It's a standard operating weapon that's used on F-16s and F-18s and A-10s, especially when you're going against columns of enemy vehicles. You hit them with the cluster munitions, you circle back and you nail them with that 30mm gun. But what do you think is going to happen? Or is this a fair justification for the West and everyone to be using about these terms? Because we've used these weapons extensively.
I think you're right, not only over the weapons, but over a lot of other things. So if you think that we NATO bombed the television station in Belgrade and killed a number of civilians there, I covered the Kosovo war, and we didn't like what Milosevic was doing, and Russia was too weak, and we separated a country off, just like he's wanting to do on Ukraine. Then we did Iraq, then we did Libya. We did Libya on the grounds that Gaddafi had said he was going to go in and murder some people, but he was a sort of big king boasting. He probably wasn't going to do that. But my sort of thought is, all of that, when China and when Russia talk about the world order, the hypocrisy of the world order, you probably just nailed it with those type of weapons and the war crimes. But what I think is happening now is that we've got 38 countries or something putting Putin and his people in for war crimes. That puts them in a corner. And that means that they won't be able to do anything except keep doing what they're doing, which means eventually that they're going to press a nuclear button. And throughout the whole process, a number of years, because you did the battlefield Ukraine 4 years ago and Crimea, I don't think the West has had the mindset to think through how to stop this happening. And because we haven't done it with China either. So so what we've been doing, instead of saying, well, okay, well, democracy didn't work in Russia, and it's turned out that we've got this almost maniac in there, how are we going to deal with this person? And instead of doing that, we're going to say, no, NATO's going to come up to their borders, and he doesn't want that, so let's just do it. and and then he just does what he does. He did Syria, he did Chechnya, I covered the Georgia war, he did Georgia. So why wouldn't he do Ukraine? And I think one thing out of here as a sort of fiction and non-fiction is that our intelligence agencies have actually redeemed themselves after the Iraq war, because they have been spot on this throughout. So when Biden and our politicians, Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, people have said they're going to do it imminently, they've been absolutely right on it.
Do you think that in light of that, because the intelligence has been pretty accurate this time around about what was going on, but knowing all of that information and knowing what was going to happen, listening to the fact that Putin was broadcasting exactly what he was going to do for months, and we can go back to Biden's speeches back in November and early December when he was talking about this buildup and talking about what they were going to do. Do you think the West fundamentally failed the Ukrainians in two regards? One, not adequately providing them with the kinds of weapons that would be required to defend against the Russians in a timely manner, meaning we only got aggressively involved with pouring weapons into Ukraine, Javelin anti-tank missiles, small numbers of Stinger missiles, and not nearly enough ammunition. But we only did this, in like the last 7 or 10 days before the Russians invaded, when we knew for a fact, nearly 3 months in advance, this was happening. And maybe if we had done more, it may have been more of a deterrence to keep Putin out. Or on the contrary side, do you think when we realized Putin was, no shit going to go in and invade and do this, do you think we fundamentally failed in just acknowledging the known fact that Ukraine was never going to get into NATO? It just is.
I think we've got this problem in Europe, particularly in Britain, of this word appeasement and of Chamberlain. And it is, it's a very real thing. But, if however many javelins and anti-tank stuff and all that sort of urban guerrilla warfare stuff we had put in wouldn't have made any difference. And it still won't make any difference. But what we're faced with now, and what's really troubling, is that we could have tomorrow or within a week a Srebrenica. We could have something that is going to make us go in and put that no-fly zone in. And either we back off and we negotiate an unpalatable settlement, which could have been done a month ago or 2 months ago, but probably cannot be done now.
And save lives before it actually happens.
Yeah. Or we go in and we go to war with Russia.
Yeah. And nobody
we risk an atomic war because the in-between is not, or we, hopefully this is what I think is that somebody like Medvedev uses a coup to get rid of Putin. And you put another strong man in underneath the strong man that's gone slightly crazy. And Medvedev's a Silicon Valley guy, so he's going to really want to unwind all the sanctions, and that might take a year or two, unwind it and get everything back to normal again. But whatever type of weapons we give to those guys, you're going to get into a Northern Ireland situation, which we've discussed. Any guerrilla war, any of us, you were in Iraq. These wars don't end. However many weapons you send in, they don't end. And Syria hasn't ended, but Syria only settled because Putin went in and settled it. Actually, so you've got the realpolitik. Forget the morality, forget the democracy and dictatorship. You've got realpolitik of how these wars operate.
Yeah, and so let me circle back then and ask Mark a question, since you give us a little bit more of the UK perspective, and then I want to circle back to Jordan and really get your take on the next step of the conflict in Ukraine, because it's going to start to morph more into what you experienced as a child growing up and a young man in Northern Ireland. It's ultimately going to end up heading that direction. So there's some very specific questions I want to ask you about that. But let me ask you, Mark, growing in the UK, do you feel that, or do you feel from the conversations with your friends and people from different political spectrums, and different people all over the place, do you feel that there is some sort of concern among the population or among your friends that you guys may, in fact, that we may end up in fact in either an unrestricted cyber war with Russia, which could be deadlier than a nuclear war, or that it could potentially turn into a nuclear war if the US and UK begin a no-fly zone and start shooting down Russian aircraft and start destroying, S-300, S-400 surface-to-air missile systems in Belarus, in Russia proper, in Ukraine, things like that. What are your thoughts on, or what do you believe people are thinking about that? Have they accepted that this could be the reality?
I mean, I have an interesting point of view there. My previous employer before my current role was actually owned by and run by Russian Estonians. And my boss there was actually a Ukrainian who moved over here when he was very young. And his wife he'd gone over and married her there and brought her back as like a childhood friend sort of thing. So I get a mix of things because I'm talking to people and seeing from people over in Estonia and over here who are from that community, but also talking to my friends. I split out politically sort of mid left, but I tend to lean to the right on the military side of things, which is always amusing. But talking to people, it's a weird situation for us. On the international side of things, it's very pessimistic and there's a lot of shock, obviously, because I suppose a general thing, both here in the UK and in the US and a lot of Western countries, was we allowed ourselves to think that the whole Cold War thing had gone away and everyone was going to be civilized. People would act up a little bit, but they'd kind of come home. Or if bad things happened, they happened a long way away and you only see them on TV. So I think the proximity side of it and the way it's affecting is striking a lot of people. In the UK itself, there's a lot of at-home politics stuff, which is shading how we see stuff as well. There's obviously a lot of buried and out there controversy about how the Russians are tied into our political structure and a lot of our media structures as well, which is running around and causing our own distractions and affecting how we are seeing things happening. But a lot of people, I think, are just coming home to the idea that the boogeyman isn't gone yet. Everyone had got happy with the way certain things worked. We'd already had to start to come around to a different way of thinking with Brexit anyway, and realizing that life wasn't quite so stable. But having this kick off so close, and with a lot of people knowing people who either have been over there, are from there or whatever, and the realization just how close it is to us. It's not in the Middle East, it's not in Africa, it's not halfway around the world or South America or whatever else. It's over the border, drive a few miles. And, one of my best friends, his wife is Polish, and luckily they're from the western side of the country, but they're nervous as hell, as you can imagine. He's nervous about it. When I find constructive stuff, I'm forwarding it to my former boss, because obviously he has friends and family still back there. But when I'm talking to people over here, there are a lot of people that are starting to realize that at some point or another, it could bloom. And there's a lot of people that are very scared because they've not had to think about things that way. And it is immediately happening and affecting things over here. As these things do, petrol prices have immediately spiked and everyone's panicking about that, because that's a standard thing. You guys have it over there as well, don't you? Everyone kicks off when petrol goes up.
Yep.
But it brings home to everyone very much how interconnected stuff is.
There's another question I wanted to ask you about this too, because you brought up a lot of good points about how there's a sudden realization that, wow, this is not very far away from our homeland, and there's a very good likelihood this could impact us or spill over really quickly. And because you're in the UK, you guys have a lot of just a lot of immigration and ties with people from these different countries, because honestly, Europe is quite small. It's half the size of the United States, but it's got a slightly larger population than us. So it's very interwoven. But is there a realization inside amongst your friends, or you think what's happening in your country, that maybe we did not we have not taken the necessary steps to prepare an adequate national defense for our own country, as well as a defensive effort to be a legitimate, like real contributor to NATO. Because if anything, this conflict has fully laid bare the fact that NATO was a paper tiger and not ready to deal with something like this.
I think less so about NATO. A lot of the people I'm talking to are more domestically focused, but it is bringing home the fact that we had built an awful lot of assumptions into socioeconomic military positions, things like that. I have friends who do serve within the Navy, especially, but I'm near Portsmouth, so it's kind of hard to avoid that. But it's the things that people have been talking about already for a while, and I know I've brought it up in conversations with people, that there is a dependence in a lot of places on putting things back. It'll be fine. The world will wait until we're ready. So in British defence circles, you see a lot with, for example, the carriers and manning for that, and also for manning ships. We have 8 Type 45s, but on a regular basis, one of them was laid out because there weren't enough people to man all of them with the right skills. On the army side of things, they keep scratching stuff down, but over and over again, we see persistent mismanagement as well. And some of that has come from the top, which is like just assumptions that, well, the Chinese need us as much as we need them to need our money. The Russians won't bite the hand that feeds them because, yes, they're grumpy, they're pretty corrupt, but they keep bringing their money over here, so they can't be that bad. And at the bottom, people didn't believe it was, a lot of people didn't believe it was ever really going to be anything more than, you know, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency stuff somewhere else. So people didn't necessarily take stuff seriously.
Do you think that people are starting to come to the realization that, or even the politicians are, that we need to actually step up now and start retooling? I don't want to say retooling for war, but actually start arming ourselves and preparing a legitimate fighting force. You know, like Germany, the chancellor there announced their defense budget is $49.5 billion euros a year. They just announced this last week a €100 billion one-off defense expenditure, which is essentially 2 years. And they're going to increase their defense spending by, I think it's 200%. So they're going from, essentially 50 billion euros a year to now 150 billion a year. And it's about freaking time, but they're like 10 years too late.
Yeah. But as I said, I think a lot of it's taking time for that to kick in for some places, but it's a lot faster than it has been for a while, than it should have, than it was going to be for a while, because everyone's been grabbed and shaken rather vigorously.
Yeah.
Over here, it's muffled by the political stuff a bit, but it kind of has to be with this sort of thing. There's a lot of people with interests in different places that are now starting to disappear. There was someone posted a link to me the other day. There's a Twitter account that follows our MPs and posts up when they start deleting things. And there's an awful lot of tweets that from back in sort of the latter part of the 2010s, talking about during the Brexit campaign about sort of insulting Europe, but also people talking about how good Russians were being for our country and things like that, that has gone away.
Yeah. As
it's suddenly become more of a realization that we were asleep at the wheel. But I think it's going to take, on the one side, on the people, on the doers side, there is a lot of things happening. On the talkers side, it's taking ages because there's still too much of this and too much of this.
Yeah. Okay. So
no one wants to hear.
So let me circle over to Jordan and ask you a quick question then on this next one. So you dealt with the Troubles and you grew up in that. It was part of your history and what you went through. We're now going to enter another phase of operations in Ukraine. At some point, well, more and more of the cities are starting to fall now. A lot of the major cities are now starting to be encircled for several days. And as that stranglehold continues to persist, these cities are going to steadily begin to run out of supplies. And as that happens, they're going to be stuck with the hard choice of, do we surrender the city or do we turn the city into Aleppo? in Homs and just make it a mess, but knowing that we're also going to starve most of our population, which is not what anyone wants to see happen. When the Ukrainians start to fight in these cities, do you think it is a problem or an issue for the Ukrainians, or something they should consider not doing? So when you have an apartment building, you can't just place, a PKM inside these apartment buildings and shoot them out of the windows at Russian tanks. And you can't just place javelins on the tops of these buildings to shoot down. Now, from a military standpoint, hell yeah, that is exactly what you do. That's what you want to do. It gives you the best tactical advantage. It gives you cover. It gives you a height elevation advantage. You can surprise these guys. You can destroy them. But I can tell you firsthand from Iraq, when that kind of stuff happens, you have turned what was an off-limits civilian target into a valid military target to be engaged. And part of me wonders if in this information psyop war we see going on, if the Ukrainians aren't intentionally turning civilian targets into military targets with the intentional mindset of drawing a horrible image against the Russians in favor of them, to try to drive an action or a response from the West. Like, if we put a bunch of machine guns and anti-tank missiles in a hospital and we start pummeling this Russian column, and then those columns report back, we're getting lit up by this hospital, so they call an airstrike and level the place and remove the threat, then the Ukrainians are sitting there with their iPhones going, see, look, war crime, war crime. But is it a war crime, or is it a self-engineered war crime? And are they doing this with the intentional design to get the West to go, oh my God, we got to stop this, and then they get what they want? Do you think that that is a problem? Because I know, maybe I'm wrong, but I believe in the Troubles there was an extreme amount of effort with the British Army to not engage those kinds of targets. And it required a level of discipline that I don't know that the Russians are capable of or trained for. But do you think that that's going to become a new problem we're going to have to deal with? Are these legit war crimes? Are these the Ukrainians turning civilian targets into military targets? And then as a military guy, with the Ukrainian army, how do they fight the Russians without turning civilian targets into military targets?
Yeah, so I think from what I've seen, from certainly through my reading of Georgia and Syria, I think the Russian playbook you've seen today, where they've announced humanitarian corridors, they have the ceasefires falling down, the bombing cities to dust. It's total war, and it's almost World War II tactics: encircle and bombard and break down the spirit and have the white flag run up the nearest flagpole. From what we were talking about earlier on, I do think NATO have sat on their hands, and certainly whether or not weapon systems, defensive systems, a build up. It's difficult to build up on the border, or certainly give a show of strength to try and push Putin back, because I think that's what he wants. I think we've got a James Bond megalomaniac villain in the Kremlin who wants to goad NATO into war. I would like to see a no-fly zone, even a partial no-fly zone. I think it's been done before, to try and limit the bombardment of those cities. None of us, no sane person, wants to go to war with Russia and have that threat of the nuclear button being pressed. Given the way things are going, as I think Humphrey alluded to, when you've backed the dog into a corner, it's only going to come out more fearsome. So, is that on the table anyway? Perhaps. But your question, urban conflict, I think we've seen that too. so many times of hospitals bombed, and is defending territory from, you know, the 3D axis of an urban warfare. Is it has to be done. I think Ukraine is now a totally different animal in that we've all seen women and children and men gathered in playgrounds making Molotov cocktails. You know, your civilian population is now by default a territorial defense force. The Russians could well roll into a city and bomb it, but I think, you know, we've got a city with a substantial underground safety system from the Cold War bunkers and the railway systems to retreat into and then launch attacks from. The bombing of the city just adds to the chaos of strike and counter-strike. And I think that it's going to end up being small, mobile teams of military who they've made the strategic decision to pull back into the cities. They were never going to defend the whole country. They're not going to be able, unless they get support, push the red line back. If you know, they're going to have to hold, take, and retake. So it's going to be urban. It's going to be small groups. I think Putin is desperate. It's just it's the playbook. He wants to force a situation similar to the shelling of the nuclear facility, to say, you know, we were engaged from Ukrainian troops. That's why we shelled back and accidentally hit then we took the nuclear system or the nuclear power plant. Yeah, it's just, I think it's going to be guerrilla. It's the war crime angle. Yes, it's a difficult one. And even talking back to the thermobaric bombs and the cluster bombs, I think, you know, it's easy to point the fingers without actually thinking how far is this going to go. Albeit if you're bombing a Iraqi army convoy, it's a military operation. It's not thermobaric bunker busters on an apartment block or a hospital.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's
part of me wonders what's
ahead.
the effectiveness of doing that, because a thermobaric weapon is largely designed to go after bunkers or underground complexes, caves, things like that. Against an apartment, it's like that's an absolute waste of a weapon. It's just the wrong weapon to use. It's not going to actually it's not going to give you the effect you want.
It depends on the effect they're aiming for, though, doesn't it?
It's the fear factor, isn't it? It's when you've got these things raining from the sky and you are trying to break the spirit of a large defending force who aren't professional soldiers, you know. But again, they're highly motivated and they seem very determined, and there's no doubt about it. We've got to day 10, and you know, certainly in the south in Mariupol, that I think the Russians are pushing to take the whole southern coast.
I think so too.
To cut those ports off, which will then starve anything coming in but from road. But for Mariupol to be still in Ukrainian hands 10 days later, I don't think was on the.
Do you think it's still in their hands right now because the Russians are, I don't want to say the Russians are necessarily showing restraint, but I think if the Russians wanted to go ahead and send 20,000 troops into the city, I think they very well could have. Or the Russians, unlike a lot of other armies, the Russians actually have a lot of artillery. And if they legitimately wanted to flatten the city, I think they just would line up, you know, a few dozen artillery battalions and just light it up. I mean, just, you know, you have, you know, 60, 70, 155, or well, in their case, 152 millimeter howitzers firing away day in, day out for, you know, a week. There won't be much left of the city at that point. And we haven't seen them actually do that level of a bombardment. I mean, maybe like a city, a particular area of the city where they're hitting enemy concentrations. But do you think they're potentially trying to cut them off and maybe starve them out, so to speak, to force them to give up, as opposed to having to go in and actually root them out? I mean, at some point, there's a decision gonna have to be made. You're gonna have to root them out. If they won't surrender, you're gonna have to root them out. But do you think that they're trying to give that a chance?
I think, I suppose, yeah, but I suppose playing devil's advocate, when you consider the column of trucks 40 miles long sitting outside that hasn't moved in a week, which could
That's a
have,
question. I wonder, like, I heard a conversation talked about that exact thing the other day. And right now you can buy commercial satellite imagery, like almost real-time satellite stuff of what's going on. And these images we're seeing of this convoy, and I'm not saying that it's not there. I'm questioning if it's still there for 3 or 4 days, because what we're seeing is essentially recycled images of the same image from day one being shown to us for 2-3 days straight, when the fact is we could be getting hourly satellite updates and we're not showing any of that. And another question I'm curious about with that too is the Ukrainian army. I don't know how the Air Force is still functional, but they still have some ground attack aircraft and some ground attack helicopters. And they've made exceptionally good use of drones in the few instances they've used them. If this column really is there for 3-4 days, I mean, I was buying it the first couple of days, but now it's like day 4. I'm like, is this really legit? It was really there. Why haven't they attacked this thing yet? Why have they allowed this thing to sit here for 4 days? Because you could have moved an awful lot of like units over to just start engaging them on the flanks and start actually doing an attack on them instead of letting them sit there for 4 days. You know what I mean? I don't know what's going on, and I'm just kind of,
Yeah,
I don't
I mean, I've seen some
doubting it, I'm just
interesting stuff.
questioning things.
I've seen some interesting stuff from some of the open source intel stuff that people have been analyzing. And there was a good one from a guy who used to work maintenance in a storage facility. And he was saying if you look at a lot of pictures of not just of the obtained equipment that some of the Ukrainians are coming up with, but some of the pictures from some of the destroyed air ground vehicles and some of the columns and stuff.
Issues with the tires. Yeah.
Yeah, but you're also seeing the cracked tires and other evidence of stuff that hasn't been maintained properly.
Correct.
And it could be there's a situation where we do know that the Russian economy has become something of a more open version of where the Soviet Union got towards the end, where it's everyone pays for protection, and you don't give bad news upwards because messengers get shot. And so it's possible that in a number of situations between that and also some of the reports about oddities in operational patterns, like people being sent outside of air cover where they can get preyed upon, or just columns stopping for normal checks and AAA and SAMs not deploying, when normally if you stop, the first thing you do is put your air cover up, is that it could be a failure more, as much in motivation and training as anything else, that's leaving them vulnerable in some parts. But with the big column, if they had maintenance casualties, but someone's got their act together and actually put the air defenses up, they could be going for easier targets. Because at the end of the day, that column sitting there, it's not doing damage to them, and they've got other things they need to worry about, especially inside all these towns that are actually being encircled.
Yeah,
they have limited amounts of mobile troops. As you said, a lot of their troops are either foot mobile, they're at best motorized, or they're effectively, they're territorials.
Yeah, and I think me and Alex were talking.
Ground.
We were talking about that the last 2 days too. Of maintenance is a big problem. So is maintaining the fuel supply for vehicles. And the Russians are attacking on a lot of different axes, and that requires a tremendous amount of a logistical supply chain to keep those different forces going. A lot of people don't realize when the Iraq war kicked off and we invaded from Kuwait to Baghdad, it took us damn near 21 days to reach Baghdad. It didn't happen overnight. And we ran into our own logistical problems of keeping all those tanks supplied with fuel because we just advanced so fast, they overshot the supply chain. And then and then when it came down to actually seizing Baghdad and securing that, that was another 6 more days of fighting before that actually happened. So part of me is wondering, we're all sitting here as if we were all part of Putin's plan. We all are acting like we were somehow included in the strategy and saying, oh, it's failing, or, oh, it's not happening. And part of me is thinking to myself, well, when did we somehow believe the Russian army was more advanced and more superior than the coalition forces that went into Iraq? Because if we couldn't get to Baghdad in less than 20 days, why did we somehow have this assumption that the Russians with a far less advanced logistical chain and obvious poor maintenance was somehow going to get to Kiev faster than we could get to Baghdad. You know what I mean? I don't
It's
know.
classic mirroring, isn't it? We
Yeah.
assume that he wouldn't do something like that because we wouldn't do it without taking certain precautions. We tend to assume, and it's been a common factor in a lot of intelligence estimates, which is what got us in so much trouble in a few places, let's be honest,
Yeah.
is that sometimes the people that are looking at the enemy are looking think they're looking in a mirror. They don't think they're looking through a window.
Yeah.
And so they see what they want to see, don't they?
Yeah.
Or you probably have run into that one yourself.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll circle back to you in a second, Alex. I want to ask a specific question on your end, because I think your experience might help. But Humphrey, real quick with this, on the logistics side, do you think that maybe we had either overestimated the Russians' capability, or do you think that we're trying to, part of the PSYOPs campaign, downplay the effectiveness of what it is they're achieving and doing, when in reality, we couldn't do that ourselves? I mean, it took the Brits quite a number of days just to get to Basra, and that was just less than 100 kilometers away.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right there. And if you think that the Ukrainian army and force is far better trained, and they have been trained up by the US and NATO forces since Crimea over 6 years, far better trained, far better equipped, and far better motivated than the Iraqi forces were. And so your timeline, those comparison timelines are very accurate. And I think we are being fed to a certain extent. Putin was meant to be there in 2 days or whatever it was. But there's another interesting comparison about that, looking through the window and looking in the mirror thing, is don't forget that, when I was going in, Baghdad, the invasion, is that the American, troops on the ground there said, we have now liberated these people. They welcome us. We are bringing them democracy. And that is exactly what the Russians are being told. Not exactly, but it's a mirror of what the Russians are being told, that they're the liberators and these are Nazi dictators. There and everything. And we were told, or your colleagues were told, we're going in and they all hate Saddam and all the rest of it. I mean, I covered Iraq.
That worked for a few months, then it was just all blew up.
But I covered Iraq before Saddam and after Saddam. And I met the same guys there on that. And, and I think this is a much said thing. What a lot of people want is so they know what the rules are. So I think that, we talked about insurgencies coming up and all this and all this stuff. I don't think Ukraine will settle.
Yeah, I agree with you.
And I think that if a deal had been cut, of which appeasement would have been one of the things up there, then people would have known what the rules were and they could have all got on with their lives.
Yeah.
But right now we've got a Northern Ireland + situation where it's not going to be settled for generations.
I know. I feel so awful about it too, because there should have been a greater effort to try to avoid it, and I always go back, when I was in Iraq, my job was an interrogator. Okay. My job was to sit down with the enemy on a, 12 to 16 hours a day and try to squeeze these bastards for intel to go kill their buddies. And that was not an easy job, especially given the rules I had to work within. But one of the things you really had to learn was you had to get inside their head and try to understand from their perspective why they were doing this to us. Yes, they hated us, but why did they hate us? What was there something going on that maybe we could try to change or do, or that I could use to manipulate to get them to give me information? If it wasn't going to lead to the capture of their buddies, then I damn well wanted the information they had of their enemies, because they were also our targets as well.
And the Russians, James, are now going to be trying to understand the same thing from the Ukrainians that they capture, because they really don't understand why they don't want to live under Russian rule.
Yeah, they don't understand. You mean you're not Nazis? And then it's the question of, well, have we been lied to this whole time? And that's exactly the realization they're going to have.
Is that the thing that turns a bit too, that it is you hear the stories that they're, the conscripts and they've been on a training exercise and turned that way.
That was terrible.
And all of a sudden, there is and let's face it, let's look what's happening with the media in Russia over the last sort of couple of 24 hours or so. They're just shutting down and shutting down.
Yeah.
Outlet after outlet. I think the thing that struck me the most over the weekend, or the sort of tail end of last week, was that the stuff that Sergei Lavrov was putting out, and the ambassador to the UN, Nevin's silly, you know what I mean, anyway. But it was just totally contradictory to what was actually happening. And I think that there's no, the people, the soldiers on the ground, the commanders on the ground, if they don't actually know this is a war that Putin's or whoever within the Siloviki have decided that this is how we're going to go and do this, it just has that that potential for a total clangor. I think, I don't, we are saying, we're trying to second guess Putin, we're trying to guess what he's doing, why is he doing it. But when you see those reports that his troops on the ground haven't been given the full information, if it's true, obviously, but it certainly in some ways looks that way.
Yeah, you're right. That's a good point too, because these guys they're on a training exercise, and part of me wonders how naive were some of these soldiers too, where it's like, you've been on a training exercise for 2 months along the border with a whole lot of rhetoric going on,
and
one
we all
plus
know
one should kind of lead you to 2.
So. Guys talk, rumor mill kicks in, and I know what you mean.
Yeah, so there's some of that. So Alex, circling back to you, I apologize that we've waited to get to you towards the end here, but one of the questions I wanted to ask you from your own experiences in the military and with the Russians, understanding them and everything else going on, is at this point, in this juncture, is there some sort of off-ramp that can allow Putin to save face while ending this war before it goes nuclear, or before before NATO ends up being dragged into this? Because Putin, at the end of the day, is not going to lose a war with NATO. He's just not, unless there's a coup and he's assassinated or he's taken out. The dude is not going to allow Russia, he's not going to allow, the First Armored Division to start rolling down towards St. Petersburg or Moscow. Those forces will get nuked, whether it's a tactical nuke or something else. And then that tit for tat just accelerates, and within 4 days, we're all wiped out. And, but there has to be an off ramp. When I was interrogating terrorists, I had to leave them an out. I had to give them an out. And if I gave them an out, they almost always took it. And I got intel I needed to go action and remove more dirt bags. But do you think that there is an off ramp or an out that could be given to Putin to prevent this from spiraling into a greater war?
No, I don't think so. I hate to be the downer, but I believe that the only realistic out or off ramp that we have right now is Ukrainian capitulation. I think that if they can manage to sack Kyiv, then maybe the Ukrainians would quote unquote give up, and at that point, maybe best case scenario, we can negotiate a settlement. And again, this is confirmation bias on my side. My belief at the opening of the war was that Putin basically wanted a buffer half of Ukraine, and so
the east of the Dnieper, basically.
Draw a line from Kharkiv to Odessa. Everything southeast of that is now, the Donbass autonomous region, whatever you want to call it. He gets the shipbuilding facilities in the south, so they can resume carrier construction. If they could defeat Ukraine and get to the negotiating table, if they could get that acceptance, that would be something. But I'm getting concerned that we're even going to get to that point. Latest rumors running around are the Russians are telling everybody that the Ukrainians are pursuing nuclear and chemical biological weapons. So now they're creating their own weapons of mass destruction narrative, and that's got to be a pretense for something. It's obviously not a pretense for the invasion, because it's coming
Already
after
here.
the invasion. So what is it a pretext for? And my biggest fear is that that's currently the pretext for the use of special weapons. And that obviously would be an escalation. Even if it's chem bio, it's not a good look for anybody. And they've already obviously violated the sovereign territory of another state.
Yeah.
Now they're about to rip up at least one of the weapons of mass destruction protocols, the chemical weapons declaration, the biological weapons conventions.
I think one thing to keep in mind though, with this war, at the end of the day, I mean, first off, I am not pro-Russian. I really think, Putin screwed the pooch here and we're putting the screws to the guy at this point. But it also comes down to the point that I legitimately don't think Putin wants Ukraine to be nothing but rubble. I don't think he wants Ukraine to be like Syria, because at the end of the day, that's not a victory for him. It's not going to serve his long-term strategic purpose. He wants the infrastructure, and he wants.
I don't disagree that he would like them, but I absolutely believe that he will take them as a pile of rubble. I mean, you got to remember how bad the Eastern Europe was, especially parts of Russia after the Second World War. So he understands that it's going to take longer, but we can turn this thing as long as it's not radioactive.
Yeah,
Alex, if I could just jump, if there is a settlement that along the lines that you said, should NATO then continue to arm the insurgents who will inevitably be there?
Well, I think that's why retaining at least half of the territory would be necessary to give the ability to have some kind of calming effect, to give Ukrainians a place to actually go. And once you do that, is there still going to be an insurgency? Absolutely. I think you can hopefully minimize it. So
we don't support it.
Right. And then that's part of the question, isn't it? I mean, I would have to sit down and think really long and hard about that.
I mean, part of the thing is when the U.S. was fighting our insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan, when we saw neighbors and adversaries providing weapons and material support to those insurgents, we didn't hesitate to go after them outside of Iraq. And that's going to be a challenge, is if Poland is becoming a massive insurgency training mecca to funnel hundreds or thousands of foreign fighters into Ukraine to kill Russian soldiers, they're only going to put up with that for so long before they're going to try to nip that training camp in the bud. And, unfortunately, that becomes an Article 5 problem then. But is Poland also in violation of the treaty by allowing itself to be a launch pad for operations against another country? And how does that all play in too? Because there has to be some sort of off-ramp, and maybe Putin can be talked down from the ledge, and maybe you do. It's not an acceptable situation. Nobody wants this, but it sure as hell beats nuclear war. Yeah. And maybe it is, unfortunately, east of the Dnieper. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the easiest solution to envision, of course, is coup in Russia. But considering the experience that whole nation has with cracking down on journalism, I think I saw a poll there, and how the hell do you get polling numbers out of Russia? I have no idea, but that even with the protests, there's still a massive support for it. And
it's been generations of conditioning, of conditioning over and over and over. It's very hard to unbrainwash a society. It's just like in China, their society is so mentally conditioned, especially with the social credit system that they have in place, that they control the narrative. There is no way out. I mean, look what happened in Hong Kong. They crushed democracy in Hong Kong, and they crushed those protesters, and there's nothing left. They have so thoroughly destroyed the democratic movement in Hong Kong that there's nothing left.
It's cleverer though, isn't it, James? The Chinese, as you were saying at the beginning, no buildings are in rubble.
Nope.
A handful of people arrested. Business goes on as usual. Sanctions are minimal. Xinjiang as well. They're keeping it at a level, whereas Putin has given a message, hasn't he?
Yeah.
Is that I will crush you.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas China says, I'll work with you. We can work this out. A few people might get hurt, but we'll make our way through.
So yeah, and we've been talking for a little over an hour, so I don't want to take up too much time of people. But one of the things I would like to close out with saying is, we're in a very tough situation right now with Ukraine, and I feel awful for the people of Ukraine who are having to bear the brunt of this. And I don't mean to minimize what they are going through or try to write them off in any shape or form. We do also need to consider 340 million people in Europe. And we need to also consider the 330 million people in the United States and the economic and environmental catastrophe that would befall all of the world should a large-scale nuclear exchange happen in defense of Ukraine. And this is why nuclear powers don't go to war with each other. There's no winning that kind of a conflict because one side has to be rational enough to accept defeat. And defeat means he's going to lose power. The West is going to come in and dismantle their country and their economic enterprise, likely peacekeepers, and it's the end of their country. And when you are sitting on 7,500 nuclear warheads, why would you accept that? And this is why it's so dangerous. And one of the ideas I have had as a way to counter this, and unfortunately, this is not something that's going to help Ukraine in the near term, is Russia has been enabled to become what it has become because the West has chosen to pursue a green energy policy at the detriment of the rest of the world. We have allowed ourselves to become hostage to dictatorships in the Middle East and to Russian energy because of our absolute fascination and suicidal vendetta we have with solar and wind, that right now in 2022, just the technology is just not here to completely replace our whole energy apparatus with it. It will be there, but it probably is like 2040, 2050. So we have to have a bridge. And the way to defeat Russia long-term without nuclear war is to unleash the energy production and capability of the Western democracies. And unfortunately, that's largely the United States. We have some of the largest untapped energy reserves in the world, in multiple different states, not just Alaska, but multiple different states. And if the US would just take up the mantle of saying, instead of being the arsenal of democracy, which we were in World War II, what if we became the arsenal of energy independence for Europe and the West from Russia and from the Middle East, and thereby remove our long-term entanglement with these hostile nations that just don't like us? Why are we propping them up and making them wealthy with this kind of economic policy or energy policy when we have the ability to deny them it? And that's been my kind of gripe and complaint is we could, again, this isn't going to help Ukraine right now, but in a couple of years, the US could completely supplant the Russian energy sector and become the dominant supplier of energy to Europe. And what would that do to Putin when his petrostate suddenly isn't needed? His only customer then becomes China. And it massively destroys his ability to build up a military and wage war, and he can no longer hold Europe hostage because of that. We have to come up with a plan beyond next Sunday of how to combat and address the threat that Putin poses and these Middle Eastern regimes pose. And until we're willing to accept that and start being realistic about that, I just don't see how we avoid, this conflict spiraling out of control or another conflict happening in a few more years over the exact same issues. I
Yes.
don't know if you have any final thoughts on that or
Well,
opinions before we close out.
Step one is to tell the Greens to pound sand and start breaking ground on some new nuclear reactors.
Yeah.
Well, we've seen in Germany, the Green Party in Germany has done a 180 and has actually started supporting the idea of keeping their nuclear reactors active longer than they were due to be because of the whole Russian side of
Right.
things. In fact, if I recall correctly, the new head of the Green Party in Germany, and let's be honest, the German Greens are known for being pretty aggressive and pretty hardcore. Even a week or two back, was starting to argue against Nord Stream 2 and Putin because of his actions.
Yeah.
So
I was actually
it's
in
entirely
Baden-Württemberg
possible.
in 2010 through 2014. I was in Baden-Württemberg and Stuttgart when the Green Party actually took control of the state government there. And at the time, they had multiple nuclear power plants that the previous state administration had taken out massive euro bonds to pay for it. And at that time, Germany was a net exporter of energy. And so Baden-Württemberg was one of the richest states in Germany because of all the energy money it was making. And then when the Fukushima nuclear accident happened, overnight, they shut these things down. And the state was now on the hook for paying for bonds for something that wouldn't generate electricity. And we saw over an 8-year period, Germany became like 70% of their energy is coming from Russia over like an 8-year period. They went from an energy exporter to an importer of a horrible regime that's now got the, now it's doing what it's doing in Ukraine because of all of this.
So with a thriller hat on, because we've all got to go now, I'll just say is that 10 or 20 years from now, Germany and Japan will both be nuclear weapons powers.
Yep.
And secondly, I just wondered if you and Alex would like to come onto my book show.
Absolutely.
Ukraine and all that, and have these things. That was the book show that you messaged me about Lena Sisko on, because we had her on. I'll send you a note about it,
Sure.
James and Alex, and we'll fix a date. Great. 7 o'clock in the morning your time, I'm afraid.
That's okay. I've got 3 kids. My 6-year-old son is in my room at 5:30, 6 o'clock, demanding we get up. So
okay,
there's no sleeping in my house whatsoever.
All right.
No
I'd love to go over all of some of that stuff again and some of more. It's an hour-long conversation, and I'll send you the details. Great.
Okay, great.
Sure.
Okay.
So we'll stop recording here, and then if y'all will stick around for just a second, we will, again, to let everyone know, we will try to host another one of these conversations in hopefully another 2 or 3 more days with a couple of different guests on here to try to, once again, bring some different perspectives, different ideas on what's happening, where we think it's going to go, and perhaps an off-ramp. At the end of the day, none of us are supporting the Russians or their actions or what they're doing, but we are all trying to figure out how do we avoid a nuclear war or a cyber war that would devastate the world and cause the death of tens of millions or even hundreds of millions, because at the end of the day, we don't want any of that. We really want to find a peaceful solution to these situations. And at some point, we gotta start thinking long-term and strategic on how are we going to make that happen. So tune in for further shows down the road.